Phil.
Hey, how's it going, man?
Good, how are you?
I am doing amazing. I'm just having a great day. You know, when you have a day that just everything works and everything kind of falls together. One of those days for me. So, I've been looking forward to this all day.
Yeah, I've certainly been excited as well. Yeah, for sure. I don't know how I didn't know about you sooner. You know, you've been working in this space for a while, it sounds like, and I thought I knew kind of the landscape of the deconstruction community. And when I stumbled across your work after you reached out, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's a lot here. Yeah,
there's a lot of people out there. I think it's really easy to find like a kind of narrow groove of deconstruction, because what happens is like, you'll notice very well when people deconstruct, it can look like a whole myriad of things, because it's not really about where you're going. It's about where you've come from.
Yeah.
And so then what people tend to do is they gravitate towards people that kind of click with them, where they're at. Yeah. Like if they go into some sort of atheism, they're probably not going to keep following kind of more Christian deconstruction. People that are reframing faith and kind of holding on to some in one way or another, or people that go into like, I don't know, something really out there like pagan or something. That feels like a move in the opposite direction for someone that's like an atheist. And so people end up in these little streams, and then like you feel like as soon as kind of a few people start pointing to other parts, you're like, holy crap, there's a whole other world here.
Yeah.
So it's just really fun to, and then even within our own little niches, my God, it's just such a fast moving thing. It's really exciting. It's hard to keep
it really
up.
is. And I was really pleased to hear that you're looking at doing some research in this area as well, and you have been doing some.
Literally just finished my report today.
Oh wow! I'm so excited to read that. Yeah.
So it's about, I don't even know how big it is. It's about like 4,000 words. It's a pretty big chunk, because it's just an initial report. Because really, what we had to do, I mean, talking to the researcher, I'm working with a research team here in the UK, because that's not my background at all. I'm not massively academic. I've got a degree, but I don't know if I earned it. Talking to the guy, he was like, first and foremost, he's like, what's deconstruction? Like, who are these people that you're measuring? And I'm like, shit. Like, I don't know. Like, this is a really nebulous term that people are using. And so tearing back the veil, looking across a whole spectrum of people, and then going, okay, how can we identify this group? And so I think we've done really well at actually identifying and finding identifiers, and actually even potentially linking it to a verified peer-reviewed scale over about 30 years. There's been a scale, it was called the Faith Development Scale. It started with some of like, I don't know if you know, like James Fowler and some of those guys.
Yeah, sure.
So early on, he was quite involved with this along with some other people. He then developed and helped run it. And then again, later there was a couple of professors in the States, I think in Texas, that revised it again. It became the revised Faith Development Scale.
Nice.
But the correlations we are seeing to people deconstructing and answering metrics for what we would consider our deconstruction based on like kind of philosophical term of what it is applied to religion, they're like unbelievable correlation. You're looking at like 91, 95, 96%. It's just, it's so exciting. So we can actually almost track how people measure on this scale. The more they are developed in their faith, which doesn't become more religious, which a lot of people would want it to be.
Yeah, sure.
It's quite the opposite sometimes. The more likely they are to be deconstructed. So we're hopefully going to be able to then identify long term, if we can track people over 5, 6, 10 years, what happens? Do they all become atheist? Is progressive Christianity just a stepping stone? Or do the atheists suddenly turn around and go, well, maybe not, you know, like people like Fowler were always quite a big fan of like a re-emergence of spirituality after seasons of atheism and thing. And so it'd be really interesting to actually track those things and get some data, you know, and say, well, actually it's a bit more complex. 20% do this, 10% do that, which is what I would imagine anecdotally from working with, you know, a few thousand people. It's going to be a bit all over the place.
Definitely. No, it's exciting to see that kind of being more developed and a bit more nuanced, and then at some point we'll deconstruct spirituality.
A whole nother level. Absolutely
yeah, for sure.
Well, it is not it is the Phil Drysdale show, that's what it's called, but it is today it's going to be the Brian Peck show. So I want to dive into your work, what you're about, we maybe talk a bit about your journey, but I'd love to like open up the whole world of religious trauma. I've had a few people on talking about their own trauma. I've had quite a lot of people on talking about that.
Yeah, for
I've had a few people that are more experienced in the field, coaches and therapists, things like that. But I know like this is your world, this is what you're about. And so I cannot wait. We can dive into that. Awesome. But do you want to maybe start by just giving kind of an overview of who you are for people that aren't familiar with your work?
Yeah, sure. I guess I can, do a high level passover here.
We can get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, sure.
Don't worry too much. We won't miss too much. We've got 2 hours. We should get into some nitty gritty.
For sure. Yeah. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker in Boise, Idaho, and I've been interested in kind of religious trauma and the deconstruction process, deconversion, as some folks call that. Just the faith transition, the experience of, questioning one's faith and, finding some other place after you kind of go through that process on the other side of that. And so that there's both a personal interest in it as well as a professional interest. And as you've pointed out, it's really hard to define some of these terms. It's hard to have a sense of like what people are self-identifying as. How can we begin to understand and measure even what we talk about kind of religious trauma? That some folks kind of think of that in a very broad sense. Any kind of negative experience, they might lump in deconstruction as a traumatic experience. And so I've been interested in taking more of a clinical look at that. Is it meeting criteria for PTSD, for example, or other stress-related disorders? And as complex trauma is becoming more recognized, it feels like a lot of religious trauma would fit more nicely under that kind of diagnoses. And so, I think wanting to, also expand the research in this area as well, getting a better sense of like what are the different kind of adverse religious experiences, which is a term that we've come up with recently, that kind of mirrors the the adverse childhood experiences. And there's massive amounts of data and research around that. But just, kind of creating another scale, looking at like what types of adverse religious experiences are people, experiencing inside of religion, and then, how do those correlate to trauma or, other kind of mental health concerns. And it feels like we're just at the very beginning stages here. Of course, folks have been harmed inside of religion, since the beginning of time. And so that's not new. And folks have experienced trauma, since, we evolved early on, and we've learned how to resolve trauma, for a long time as well. But in terms of having like a really good, clear understanding of that, it feels like we're just at the very beginning stages. And so I'm really passionate about that. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Religious Trauma Institute, and part of our mission there is to provide clinical training for mental health professionals, psychoeducational workshops for survivors, just kind of expanding the conversation from a trauma-informed perspective. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's what I'm about. That's what I'm passionate about. Yeah, for sure.
That's amazing. I guess before we start, as we start, I guess, you mentioned this is a personal thing for you. Could you maybe talk about a bit of your journey and why this is a personal thing for you? Yeah.
So I essentially grew up in the church. My parents got saved when I was like between 3 and 4, I think. My dad had grown up in a Christian home. My mom had never attended church, didn't grow up as a Christian. And so it's funny that I have a few faint memories of life before church, and it was like we had a television in our home, and then after church, of course, we didn't have TV because we joined a very fundamentalist evangelical Christian group, and so so I don't have a lot of memories
trauma,
before that.
Talking about trauma, childhood TV.
Right? Yeah, I know exactly. Yeah. Yeah, but things really changed in our family. It was super conservative in terms of, dress code and expectations. I went to church school K through 12, made it through 1 year of Bible college before things began to really fall apart for me. I had questions before then. But that's when I was like, I met non-believers who were compassionate and caring and, amazing humans. And it really began to undermine what all the caricatures of, non-believers that I'd grown up exposed to. And so that began, a bit of a journey. As you know, it's not a flip a switch and you kind of go from, a believer to some other form of human. But I think in graduate school is when I began to realize how important it was to do some additional work beyond the deconstruction of the beliefs themselves. It was more about finding new ways of being or new ways of thinking. And my wife, who I was dating at the time of the tail end of my deconstruction, or leaving the church, I should say, she said to me while I was in graduate school, she said, Brian, you're still a fundamentalist. You're just fundamentalist about different things now. And of course, a huge wake-up call, because I was becoming very progressive in a social work program, very social justice oriented. And I had, effectively identified the new in-group and out-group. I knew who the good humans were and the bad humans. And I was holding very tightly to beliefs. And I could defend my new beliefs as being objectively healthier for me, better for the world. And yet how I held those, how I carried those, how tightly I grasped a hold of those and wielded against others, I began to recognize as being, still there were traces of fundamentalism in how I was approaching that. And so then, that sent me down a journey of psychological flexibility. There's various, therapy modalities that really focus on that, kind of holding lightly to our beliefs, our thoughts. And then from there, just realizing that there are a lot of folks who've experienced trauma in the church or connected to religion, and then became more focused on that work as well. And so I still do some coaching with deconstructing folks, helping people find more connection to their humanity and freedom in terms of their own choice and clarifying their values and moving forward. But the bulk of my work now is focused on trauma.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, trauma in and of itself is such a new concept that we're wrapping our head around the psychological community.
Right. For sure.
That's a very early concept. I mean, I can't remember what year it was, but it was pretty recent that it was kind of like codified as this is a diagnosis we can start handing out. So subsets within that, something like religious trauma. I know like Marlene Winnell and other people have really pushed for like something like RTS, religious trauma syndrome, and things like that. And that's not a diagnosis. You wouldn't get given that as a because it's not. We're barely starting to kind of subset trauma as a broader concept, like as PTSD or something. Can you talk about? Can you talk a bit about trauma and maybe? You talked very briefly at the beginning, kind of, there's so much stuff that's happened to people. There's so much going on, and so much of that is hard. But, I feel like there's a risk of us minimizing a whole category, and on some level this is all subjective. The human brain doesn't know that a war vet had it worse than you. Right. It doesn't know, right? So your pain is as bad as it gets because that's as bad as it got. But there is an element of, a potential in us kind of like minimizing a diagnosis, minimizing an experience by calling, I don't know, not getting to watch TV more than 30 minutes a day because your parents are religious or whatever. It may have been traumatic, but probably wasn't. Probably just pissed you off and made you a bit disgruntled. Or a silly example, of course, but this is a huge spectrum of how we suffer as growing up in fundamental homes. Could you kind of break that open a bit for us? And I
think it's really important, this conversation, because I have a few issues with religious trauma syndrome because it feels like it's a catch-all term that if you look at, the various symptoms that Marlene Linnell has identified, you have, the whole gamut from, all the symptoms from anxiety disorders to depression to, PTSD. And it feels like it's too broad to be of any real value from a trauma perspective. I think also it tends to focus more on, kind of religion being a bit inherently harmful for folks and the beliefs not being true, and therefore, there's some inherent harm to that. I'm wanting to center the conversation more around, trauma as we understand trauma. And as you mentioned, it's an evolving field. And even as we think about how trauma, in terms of coming into the psychological world as being kind of shell shock, the war vets. And initially we kind of conceptualized trauma as existing inside the event. The event was the big thing. And was the event significant enough to warrant the diagnoses of trauma? And as we learn more about trauma, there is this subjective element to it. There's a kind of a mismatch between your body's internal and external resources and the level of stress that you're experiencing. And when our body becomes overwhelmed and we don't have the capacity to handle that, and then we're not able to kind of come back to a place of feeling safe and okay. That's what trauma, it doesn't exist in the event itself. It exists in our physiological response to the event and then the lasting impacts of that. And so when we think about religious trauma, a definition that we're kind of working on is religious trauma results from an event, series of events, relationships, or circumstances within or connected to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that is experienced by an individual as overwhelming or disruptive and has lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. I know that's a mouthful, but there's the component of the event and then how the event is experienced and then the lasting kind of impacts of that or effects of that. And from a clinical perspective, we're interested in the event, but that's not a primary focus because we recognize that, depending on, a person's history and, the amount of internal and external resources they have, if we were to line up three of us and witness, a car accident or something kind of horrific that happened in front of us, one person's nervous system may mobilize to move toward the accident to offer assistance. Another person's nervous system may, kind of freeze and become paralyzed in that situation. Another person's nervous system may, mobilize to escape, and they're running away. And we might say, but the event was traumatizing because it was a really horrific accident that happened in front of us. But how that's experienced by each person will determine whether it would meet the criteria of trauma. And so we're not so interested in the event itself. And in fact, as we learn more about, developmental trauma, early childhood trauma, complex trauma, the experience of neglect and, a caregiver who is at times caring and compassionate and at other times, punishing and abusive, those kinds of situations are more traumatizing, as it were. The effects of those are more impactful on a person's life than a single incident trauma, like something you experience on the battlefield or, some horrific thing happening in front of you. And so, thinking about religious trauma from that perspective, we're not so focused on, the experience itself as being the thing that's resulting in the trauma, but it's our response to that. Were we able to defend ourselves, escape to safety, to feel a sense of autonomy inside of that? And if not, then we want to be curious about, like, how's your body responding now? Are you kind of bracing against the world? Is there a feeling of being powerless or stuck or trapped, which tends to indicate an unresolved kind of survival response? And so we don't think of trauma also as living primarily in our mind. Trauma lives in our body as opposed to the narrative that we construct from that experience. That's important. And we can begin to, kind of work with those thoughts in more of an integrated, in more of the integration phase of resolving trauma. But if we're not addressing the needs of the nervous system first, we're not going to make much progress.
Yeah. Talk to me about that, because in my understanding, that's a new discovery within the new discovery, almost. The concept of the somatic system kind of like holding that and all these different things.
Yeah.
Like, that's a pretty hard one for most people to wrap their head around, because generally we engage with a lot of these psychological conditions as a psychological condition, right? It's all in the head, or however we talk about it. Of course, the body doesn't really have these nice, clean Descartesian kind of lines. But what does it mean for trauma to be in the body? Like, are we talking? Like,
So
explain that for someone.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm fascinated and baffled by that in many ways. And I've looked at it. I've tried to study it, and I'm still like, that's crazy.
I think the research around the polyvagal theory and kind of how the nervous system is organized in our body gives us a lot of clues. And so our body's communicating with itself, and we call that neuroreception, right? Even as we're talking, my heart rate is adjusting based upon the amount of stress I'm feeling, and I'm not really aware of that. It's just happening under the surface. Some of those messages never go to the brain and then back down again. They're just organ to organ as part of the polyvagal nerve in our body. And so when we think about what it takes for a mammal to survive, we're constantly assessing our environment for cues of safety and cues of threat. And if we detect a threat, then our body mobilizes to escape to safety or neutralize the threat. And those messages often are communicated, within our system without being encoded as a thought or as a command from the brain. And then those messages, then what our body is experiencing in terms of what does get to the brain, 80% of those neurons are firing toward the brain, and 20% are firing back to the body, which also makes a great deal of sense from a survival perspective. You want quick, efficient, responses to threat. If a car swerves in your lane, you instantly react, and then there's a story of like, oh, look how fast I got out of the way, or like, why is that person driving like that? But in terms of like a decision or like a mental, kind of response to that, our body's doing all that calculation without our awareness, without our consent. That's happening as part of the autonomic nervous system. And so when we think about trauma as existing in the body, and so if I'm experiencing a threat and I'm able to escape to safety, that's less likely to result in trauma. Or that trauma it will be easier to resolve typically. But if I feel overwhelmed, trapped, stuck, not okay, and I go into more of a freeze-collapse response, then that feeling, that sense of I'm not safe, I'm not okay, I'm not able to do what's necessary, will be this unresolved kind of experience in our body. And then those messages will go to our brain, of course. You can't escape, you're not strong enough, capable enough of doing this. And then our mind will construct a narrative that kind of makes sense of that. And often when we think about trauma from a more of a psychological or cognitive perspective, we're like, well, we need to reframe the narrative. We need to tell our body, hey body, guess what? You're an adult now. You got this under control. Look around you, everything's safe. Like there's no reason to kind of be bracing against the world. Like, just kind of you're okay now. There can be some benefit to that, but it's not very efficient. It doesn't tend to be sustainable either, because our body doesn't speak English. Our body doesn't, care about words, about story, about narrative. It cares about feeling safe. And often we think about trauma as this unresolved survival response. Your nervous system wants to have a different experience that kind of undermines that original experience. Is that making sense?
It makes huge amounts of sense. I guess my parallel that I would associate with this, I live with chronic pain. I've had chronic pain for about 10 years. And the modern concept of pain has just radically changed to kind of line up with what you're talking about. And researching that has helped me a lot and understanding. But it's the same thing, these SIMs and DIMs, safety signals and danger signals. And at the end of the day, every type of pain is kind of completely unrelated to whether you're injured or not. It's based on, have you got more danger signals than safety signals? And your body goes, crap, pain, send pain. Something will change if you do that. And that's why you can blow your leg off and not be in pain. And you can also see a spider bite you and it didn't actually bite you and be in excruciating pain just because you got enough danger signals. But I guess the thing that I've been taught in that's really quite profound is we then have this long-lasting chronic pains can develop when we receive these danger signals. We don't then feel safe afterwards. We don't then, you have this flood of danger and then there isn't a flood of safety afterwards to make you go, oh, it's over, it's resolved. It's kind of what you're talking about here. And then what happens is the brain or the nervous system, your axioms and all that, they fire together because they wire together and you learn this pain. Are we basically talking about exactly the same system? It sounds like in a lot of ways.
It's very similar, sure.
Same principles at least.
And so if we were to use a bit of an unrelated example, and then I'll tie it back to a kind of a religious example. If you're watching a nature show and you see the gazelle trying to outrun the cheetah, and just before the cheetah pounces, the gazelle just kind of like collapses and goes into this kind of freeze collapse. Prior to that point, it was all fight or flight. It was just all systems go, heart racing, adrenaline's pumping. There's just like this, I need to survive, and then the nervous system slams the brakes on. Because now the best chance of survival requires not running. If you keep running, it's toast. You're over. It's lights out. But if you collapse, there's a chance that the predator won't continue to attack you, and so there's no guarantee that that's going to be an effective survival response, but it often is. And then also in that state, the brain. Your body produces chemicals that reduce the amount of pain. You feel a bit dissociated, disconnected from that. Near-death experiences or really horrific experiences that are traumatic. Often, folks have very fragmented memories around that because they're the experience of it feels very disembodied, disconnected, and so there's a merciful kind of element to evolution there in terms of that kind of preparing to die. But also in that state, predators often won't attack an animal that's not moving. They're visually oriented towards the thing that's moving. So there's some survival benefit to that. If an animal's immobilized already, they may be ill. And if I, eat that animal, then I may, also be ill. And so there's a chance that could benefit their survival chances. Or, like, okay, this animal's already dead, so I'll just, go get my cubs and come back. And, when you see that gazelle kind of spring back, come out of that freeze collapse state, it's imperative to its nervous system to complete that prior process. If it doesn't, if we were to, put that mammal in a cage and not allow it to run, it would just cycle in and out of this freeze collapse response. It would come out like it would, hit the bars and like, whew, and then freeze again. And so if we think about how important that is and why that's important, if that nervous system doesn't know that it escaped or has a felt sense of having escaped, it gets locked inside of that kind of freeze collapse response. Yeah. And then if you follow that gazelle as it kind of goes, it runs away, it'll run just full speed and then eventually kind of slow down. And then its body will kind of tremble and shake. And as its nervous system comes back online, and then it's just like eating grass again, the trauma's resolved. Which is amazing, right? It's fascinating to see like your body can do this. We humans, unfortunately, are really clever and we have language and we can construct stories and narratives and we can have, abstract ideas and thoughts and we can reconnect to those traumatic events in different ways. And we don't recognize that how important it is to kind of complete that process. And so to just change the story, to be like, oh, that's over now, you're good. Logic and reason would say you shouldn't be feeling what you're feeling. But try to tell that to a nervous system that doesn't trust you because it needs to feel safe. And how does it feel safe? It needs to feel strong. And how does it feel strong? Well, it does what needs to be done. It says what needs to be said. It has the experience of resolving that. And Yeah, it's really, it's changing how we think about trauma, how we approach it. Cognitive approaches are falling to the side as we're recognizing they're helpful in terms of reorganizing our story about trauma, but in terms of resolving it, it doesn't tend to be as effective.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's really fascinating. I guess the reason I was going to bring up pain was understanding that these heightened danger signals that need to be flooded with safety signals. One of the primary ways that I had different psychologists work with me and stuff, and it was fascinating. I went to the pain clinic, one of the top pain clinics in the UK. They had 18 people on staff, and none of them were medical doctors. And of the 18 people, 16 were psychiatrists. One was a physiotherapist, and one was a nurse, I think, that could prescribe medicines and stuff. But it's fascinating to me. But anyway, so we sat down with these people, and they were like, well, actually, what you need to do is, so my pain is in my hands. And they were saying, you have learned when you use your hands, your system goes, send Phil pain signals, get him to stop using his hands. It's dangerous. It's going to damage him. It's going to hurt him or whatever. And they were like, what you need to do is find safe ways to use your hands and push them into a little bit of pain, but then tail it back so that they go, oh, yeah, I'm safe. I thought I was in pain, but it's fine. And I guess that's why I guess I'm interested. Does the parallel kind of flow there where what we're trying to do then when we're looking at people that haven't resolved this trauma, that are learning that maybe they're in a situation where, I don't know, you probably would have much better examples of what a religious trauma system might be, but people that have...
Yeah, I was going to say, would you like me to offer one of those? Yeah, sure. So I think maybe this could help frame the more of a conversation around this as using a concrete example. And you'll be familiar with this example. You know, the fear of hell is super common for folks who grew up inside of really fundamentalist groups that believed in a literal hell. And if we think about, you know, hell as being traumatizing as an idea or a belief, that's not quite the case, you know. As a kid, I was exposed to various other stories and, you know, fiction that I read, horrific depictions of different experiences, and those didn't result in trauma for me. But there was something about hell that was different, and it's not because, you know, I'm already anticipating some of the maybe evangelical folks who might be listening to us now and saying, well, the reason hell is different is because it's real. But that's not actually the reason why hell results in trauma. When I experienced hell as an idea, I was in a church service, and I was gripping the pew in front of me, and my body went into a survival response. And I needed to escape to survive. I needed to defend myself against this threat. And my heart is racing, and I'm like, this isn't okay. And the Christian folks around me were like, yeah, that's the Holy Spirit, or that's, you know, the conviction. It's like, well, no, that's a mammal that is perceiving a threat that's very, very real in its experience, and it's trapped. I couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
It wasn't safe to leave, right? I needed to leave. I needed to stand up and defend myself. I needed to, you know, have the experience of being safe because I did what was necessary, but I wasn't able to. And so the religious trauma doesn't exist in those beliefs themselves. It exists in our physiological response to them. And so when it comes to resolving the fear of hell, in my experience, from a trauma perspective, we can deconstruct the idea, you know, for years, and people do. We can read all the books. We can talk about how hell was not even, you know, part of the original, you know, manuscripts. We can talk about how it's, you know, evolved over time. We can talk about how, you know, how could a just, loving God, you know, even conceive of such a thing, and we could have just this really crystal clear cognitive understanding that hell doesn't exist, and yet you still wake up in the middle of the night, you know, with your heart racing and you're sweating. You feel like, you know, it's the end of the world. What your nervous system needs in that experience is to have the experience of resolving that. And so for me, that looks like having the felt sense experience of standing up in that church service and saying, no, how dare you? I know what you're doing. You're using fear to try to control me. How dare you, you know, just no, pushing back, defending myself. or saying like, this is not for me, I'm out of here, And if my body were to feel what it felt like to escape, now my nervous system can have a sense of, you can do what's necessary to defend yourself against hell. Right. And so I think that gives us a kind of a different perspective on, what trauma is, but also why it doesn't live in our head. The deconstructing it piece can be helpful, and it can be a way to get to a place of, now I'm willing to, take the next step. But if we think it's all in our head, we're still going to have this persistent physiological response to a threat that we didn't resolve.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I do a weekly Q&A on Instagram, and literally every single week I get this. Yeah. Every day I get maybe 4 or 5 people messaging me, asking me, like, how do I deal with this fear of hell and this trauma? And that is always one of my suggestions. I'm like, hey, one thing that's many, many people find deeply helpful is to educate themselves and just learn. There is, oh gosh, that was one view out of many, and actually there's not even that much credit to it. Or might even be. So even if I'm wrong and there is a God, it's probably not going to send me to hell. Oh, cool. So there's a component of that, but it's one of probably about 6 or 7 different suggestions, and all the other ones aren't an intellectual conversation that we have. That they are very guttural, and that's without me educating myself even on religious trauma. That's me just working with people over time and going, this is what's working. It's working to help them get into therapy with someone that does CPTSD work, or it's helpful for them to process this in a much more tangible way, do visualization exercises and things like that. And that to me is very counterintuitive for the vast majority of us. We don't think like this. We don't approach these kind of solutions. Even that concept of non-talk therapy is, for most people, they're like, well, what do you do in therapy if you're not talking? Like that's all we do. So, I mean, what are some of the kind of main kind of therapeutic processes that people going through religious trauma that they could go about exploring? I know EMDR is a huge one right now. It seems like everyone and their mom is doing it.
Sure. It's a bit of a fad at the moment. And I think it's really effective for some folks and not as effective for others. I don't do EMDR myself, but I recognize that it is quite effective.
Sure.
I don't want to open up a can of worms here, but I think EMDR also is a bit cognitive. It's about kind of the fragmented memories and reconstructing a narrative, and so I think it's effective if that's where the primary source of your suffering is around those memories.
Right.
There is some embodied component to that. There's kind of a body scan that when it's done well, it really incorporates that. Talk therapy, like you just mentioned, you're like, well, that's kind of what we think about when we think of therapy. Here I'm going to describe what's going on in my life, and the therapist will kind of validate, reflect back, maybe ask some questions. And when we look under the surface of what's actually affecting change in that relationship, it has very little to do with the words. And I'm fascinated, as you might imagine, by like what is effective in therapy. And when we ask clients, and they've done research on this, they don't describe like, well, I was able to reframe this idea and have a new way of thinking about it. That's not the primary thing that they're saying was effective. They're saying in therapy, something shifted. I felt something different. I had a different physiological experience that was transformative. And so even in talk therapy, when we're maybe consciously focused on the words and the story and the narrative, there's another nervous system sitting across from you. And as you say, wow, I went through this really difficult time and this is what happened to me. And they're like, oh, yeah, that was really difficult. There's a sense of, okay, this other person's okay with this information. They're okay with this experience. They're not running out the door. This isn't overwhelming them. There's this ability for mammals to co-regulate one another. And this happens, from infancy on. An infant doesn't know whether something is safe or not, but they're checking in with the other nervous systems in that space to get those messages. And when we think about that in a talk therapy setting, I suspect if we did talk therapy without, kind of vocal prosody, the sing-songy nature of our voice, without any visual component to that, without any other sensations of connection, it probably wouldn't be super effective. But even when we read the words on the page, we have a felt sense of like, oh yeah, that sunset the person's describing, like, oh yeah, that's beautiful, and I'm feeling that in my body. So it's almost impossible for us to do pure talk therapy. There's a somatic component to it, and when we look at what's effective in therapy, it's often that those physiological shifts that are doing the heavy lifting. Yeah.
So are there particular practices or types of therapy that you would recommend people keep an eye out for? Because obviously there's people that will say they specialize in a field, which obviously that's a great one to keep an eye out for. I'm sure you could be like, anyone that obviously is saying they specialize in in trauma, CPTSD, all that kind of stuff. But when people look for a therapist, they're often going, oh, do they do CAT? Do they do CBT? All these different types. Is there particular types that you're like, oh, it just gets in your body. It's how you really see some great
probably
progress.
The most popular one or the most well known would be somatic experiencing, SE. I would definitely recommend that. Any kind of body-based, somatic-based therapies, do your own research, become familiar, because I think that the most important part with therapy as well is that therapeutic relationship. And so even if you have a therapist who is highly skilled, it's like, does my nervous system relate to theirs?
Are you getting those safety signals?
Yeah, for sure.
Therapists are terrified.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Probably a bit far for that time, but
no, but actually that happens. It's for reasons that the therapist has no control over.
Of course.
When I'm doing therapy in my office, I'm wanting clients to know that we can move things if we need to. If there's certain colors or certain smells, like we'll do what we can to make the space, safe for them. And just that, realizing how important that is. So I think any kind of somatic-based approaches, folks who work from a Polyvagal Theory perspective, that's not a therapy modality per se, but it's a framework, it's a perspective on the nervous system, and there's some more work happening to kind of bring that into the therapy space.
Do you think when it comes to looking at therapists, I know that with the Religious Trauma Institute, you're looking at trying to train people with who are looking to help people with trauma, but needs some level, next level education. You are going for a religious component to that as well, though, right? Am I right in that you want to help people understand the religious component of the trauma, not just trauma? Do you think it is important? I mean, I'm sure you could get some progress without that, but do you think there is a significant difference finding a therapist or someone to work with you that understands the nuances involved with religious trauma as opposed to trauma in general?
Yeah, there's a few different ways of answering that. I think if I had to choose between someone who knew a lot about religion versus someone who knew a lot about trauma, right? I'm going to go with the trauma therapist, right? But all things being equal, if you're showing up and you're working with a therapist who is highly skilled in working with trauma, and you're spending a fair amount of time educating them about purity culture and how that just, was difficult for you, or, other kind of religious experiences, and you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know, like this happens, and so I think there can be that level of comfort knowing that someone understands what you're saying. In fact, in some of the coaching that I do, which is not therapeutic per se, but it's more psychoeducational and can help people develop a framework around religious trauma. A lot of my clients are working with their therapists locally, and then, consulting with me to kind of bring that religious trauma understanding to that process. And so, yeah, I think ideally, if you're working with a client as a therapist who's experienced trauma in a particular context, to educate yourself about that is really helpful to the client. It's not their job to educate you. And so we want to provide resources that therapists can get up to speed. The other piece that I think is important and worth noting is if you're working with a therapist and that trust in that therapeutic relationship is so important, and the source of your trauma is religious in nature, and then, 3 or 4 sessions in, they're like, oh yeah, I go to that Baptist church too down the road. And you're like, woof, all of a sudden the level of safety and trust begins to take a serious hit. And then especially when maybe well-intentioned therapists are dismissive of the experience. Well, it wasn't that bad. Really, church, that's why you are having a hard time functioning in the world because of church. It wasn't that bad for me. And I think just increasing the awareness around that, just, giving this a name, helping people recognize that church can be an amazing source of strength and connection and community for folks. They can also be a source of harm in the same way that families can be and relationships can be. And then recognizing what is it about church that tends to correspond with trauma, the power and control, the secrecy, the amount of autonomy or lack of autonomy. How does that impact a person's experience, a sense of safety? And one of our goals also down the road is to do some harm reduction work with kind of churches and religious organizations. Because as you know, the feedback loop from folks who have left, that goes back to the leadership of the churches. That loop is often broken, right? Yep. There's and when people do report back, they're dismissed. Once you're outside, you're outside. Yeah. And if it didn't work out for you, well, then you weren't spiritual enough. You weren't praying enough. There's something wrong with you. And so that there really is no accountability there, or very little accountability, I should say. And we need to find ways to help religious organizations understand, as you and I talk to people every day who are saying this happened and that happened, and I tried to reach out to someone and I was told to pray about it, or we don't cause a fuss because it'll reflect poorly on the organization. Then you realize that, built into some of these systems is this ability to kind of perpetuate trauma as opposed to recognizing it. Yeah.
I mean, my brain is just exploding with ideas and thoughts, but, I'm just thinking of the research that we're doing, looking at the community of people that deconstruct. And obviously that overlaps with a whole bunch of other communities, de-churching, deconversion, all these different things. But I mean, to be able to sit down with a church and say, look, we've looked at this group that you are saying, I have no idea what all these people are doing. Right. Despite them having sat down and explained to you very well many times why they've left. But to be able to sit down almost as a impartial third party and go, do you want to have a look at data on this group of people? Yeah. And we can point out that actually, I don't know, 15% of them all have trauma on some level from their religious upbringing. And these are the kind of roots of it. These are why they say they have it, or what we've highlighted. That kind of thing, I can see opening doors that just aren't being opened right now. Like you're talking about, this is just in one ear, out the other. Yeah. And the amount of pastors I've talked to, where I've talked to people that go to their church and they're going, I have no idea why these people are leaving. And I'm like, they told me the conversation you had. They told me what they told you. Yeah. You definitely know why they left. You just cognitive dissonance right out of that one. Yeah, for sure. I want to talk about the Christian therapist component, because people give me a lot of shit for this, especially Christian therapists. But I would say 9 times out of 10, do not even consider a Christian therapist. There's plenty of therapists out there that are not Christian to not even go there. Because in my experience, it is really common, this dynamic of Christians really struggling to accept there's anything wrong with Christianity or some form of Christianity, and in some way, shape or form, massively allowing that. I mean, obviously there's a code of ethics that you have to live to as a therapist. And I've seen them massively break that on a whole nother level where they really do cross lines. But I think just on a very subconscious level, there's a protection of my, existential framework, right? Is Christianity. That's how I exist. It's my narrative. I don't want to go there. You're making me feel unsafe, right?
Yes,
And so do you have thoughts on it? Do you recommend people kind of avoid, people that are religious or whatever, if possible? Or
I do have some thoughts on that, and I think, back to what I just said a few moments ago, if given the choice between, even a religious therapist who is really well versed in trauma versus a secular therapist who, doesn't have a lot of skills with trauma, that would be a harder choice for me. But if we were working more from a body-based, somatic-based approach where the story, the narrative, the kind of content of my experience wasn't as, front and center, then I still might err on the side of the highly skilled trauma therapist who is a Christian. That being said, that's going to be more difficult when you're initially showing up for therapy, when you're, beginning to work through your trauma, because that therapeutic relationship is so important. Once there's a bit of stability, and I can handle a person having different beliefs or ideas than me, and we're just here for the trauma piece, my nervous system's response to the trauma piece, then it's possible to do that. But I think in general, what you're saying is spot on. If you are showing up and there's the implicit biases of the therapist, like you said, as a questioning Christian or as a non-believer or an ex-believer, you represent a threat to their nervous system in that space, because you're saying church harmed me and you're wanting to defend it in order to maintain your own sense of safety in that space. And, therapists should recognize that and find, better options for clients. I think we have this idea that we can work with anyone as therapists because we, like you said, we have our code of ethics, and we know, to withhold judgment and meet people where they're at and be very open and accepting. That being said, when you have implicit biases and, you're bringing things to that relationship that you're not aware of even. And if you're a Christian therapist working with, someone who's deconstructing, but they're showing up because of, work-related anxiety or something, well, then you're probably going to be okay. But if we're talking about church and how that's harmed me, that's going to make that, more difficult.
Yeah. Have you come across, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, I've come across a lot, even in my own personal experience of Christianity, therapy is a big no-no in a lot of circles, right? Your therapy is from your pastor, right? Who probably did like 2 weeks of courses in seminary on how to, help someone. And almost across the board does horrific damage 9 times out of 10, these kind of on that level. I know a lot of pastors have proper qualifications, are fully qualified, and I'm not talking about that group of people necessarily. Sure. Although I'm certain they'll fall into some don't talk bad about my church.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But there's a component that I've come across where some people, as they are early in their deconstruction, they're not really wanting to let go of their faith. They're not wanting to let go of their Christianity completely. They're maybe identifying, gosh, some of this was toxic. I don't know if I believe in hell anymore, and I can see how that's really damaged me. But they're actually quite fearful of therapy as a whole, maybe because they come from that background. Or maybe they're certainly open to therapy from a Christian, but not so much from a secular. Do you have advice on how people navigate that process of I guess, going from a place where just therapy as a whole, just showing up to therapy is a dangerous thing for you? Is there a way people can kind of approach that? Or I'm probably asking for a miracle there. I don't know where I begin.
I think it is a challenging question, and it'll depend on the person, of course. But I think acknowledging that if you're showing up to a secular therapist, especially, and you're like, I'm kind of, this is new for me. I didn't, grow up going to therapy, or it was kind of off limits, and I'm not really sure what to expect. I think sometimes just kind of being upfront about that. This is a concern that I have. And then, that at least allows the therapist to kind of acknowledge that fear. I work with believers, and I work with folks who have experienced religious trauma, and they're wanting to, reconnect to their church or another church. And I'm more than happy to help them through that process, recognizing like what are the things that are maybe a bit risky or scary for them, having worked with believers in the past with, something as simple as mindfulness. They're like, oh, like that feels a little bit new agey, right, and that's like kind of off limits. And like, okay, so I don't use mindfulness as a word. I'm like, we're just noticing, we're just being aware. Like, I just kind of like notice the colors in the room. And all of a sudden I'm not, trying to trick them into doing mindfulness, but we're just saying mindfulness as a term maybe comes with some baggage for you. And really what we're talking about is just noticing how your feet touch the ground when you're walking. And, that's kind of cool to notice that. It helps you connect to the present moment a bit more. And then often they're able to connect it to more meditative, Christian prayer and other kinds of, experiences that work for them. And so I think acknowledging that can be helpful. And then, if a therapist has no clue what you're talking about or why that would be an issue for you, that may be a sign as well. But I think a lot of therapists would understand that, therapy is scary for a lot of us, even if we didn't grow up believing that it was, maybe of the devil
it's
or
a very
something to be.
Thing, isn't it? So,
it is. It can be. Sure. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. No, that's good. And I guess in a similar vein, I'm really interested because at the beginning you talked about being quite fundamental in your shift, and your wife pointing out, or your partner, going, "Hey, because you're still kind of fundamental." And this is really common. This is a really common. This is just how we psychologically develop. We live in a very fundamental black and white world, and then we start to realize it's a bit more gray and evolve and become a little bit less dualistic. And this, to me, is. It's such a pitfall, and a lot of people that are thought leaders, but even people that are in therapy or in places where they're trying to help people that are coming out of very toxic environments. No one's disputing that. I think of someone like Marlene Winell, who I think is amazing. I really do. And I think she's done phenomenal work, but she is very black and white. There's no question about if you ask her, what do you think about religion? You don't have to ask her, right?
She's already said,
And so someone like Marlene would be very blunt and to the point about, no, religion, you need to draw a line, get out of that world. Don't go into spirituality. And these are dangerous areas. You come out and you're safe and you're going to get better. But you talked about a bit more nuanced and maybe there is a little bit more of an open approach to this that could probably say, well, actually, I can imagine certain religious frameworks would be really helpful for certain people, or certainly that certain spiritualities could be very helpful for certain people. Do you have thoughts on what components of religion are the bits, if we can be a bit black and white, if we can go, okay, but here's the red flags, here's the landmines, right? Yes, go play in this field, but you see the big bits I'm circling? Don't go near those.
Yeah, sure.
Can you maybe identify what you see in religion as some of the most kind of dangerous, traumatic kind of...
Yeah, so we actually... we have a survey as part of the Religious Trauma Institute on adverse religious experiences, and we've been asking folks over the last 6 months or so. I think we have over 2,000 respondents, and so we have a sense of like what people experience as part of adverse religious experience, what they felt like at the time, what they continue to feel over time, and then also there's just kind of open-ended questions about, describe what that was like, or, what kinds of experiences are there. And so we're collecting a fair amount of data. It's not, a clinical study or an academic study, but it's an exploratory survey. Like, we want to get a sense of what are the next questions to ask. And but what we're learning from that is the number one thing that folks experience at the time is shame. And feeling kind of powerless. And so that's not surprising from a trauma perspective that would be the case. But then over time, what a person experiences is distrustful of others. And so there's that kind of, barrier to connection and relationship. And then I think shame is still in the top 5 in what people continue to experience after having, spent some time. There's been some time between the initial event and now. And so when we think about the role of shame, just in terms of how groups function and the adaptive component to shame in terms of keeping people in line, and that in-group versus out-group. And if you're cast out of the group, it's a bit of a death sentence from an evolutionary perspective, because you can't survive alone. You need the group. And also the group needs you. And so there is that need to control, and shame does serve an important function. At least it has in the past, when you couldn't kind of seamlessly move from one group to another. And so the amount of control and fear and shame that's baked into some of these religious structures, and then that kind of ties into consent. If I'm not free to leave without, punishment, then am I actually consenting to be part of this? And I think there's a lot of factors that can contribute to that feeling of being stuck or trapped or powerless, which tends to correspond with trauma. And so, is the group open to, outside, observation or accountability, or does everything happen in-house? Do we handle all the problems inside? And when there's that secrecy, I think you're just creating conditions for trauma. You're creating conditions for abuse. And I don't think religions, or churches especially, I don't think they, got together one day and decided, like, how can we create the most controlling environment, and kind of create these conditions that are perfect for abuse and harm. I don't think it was intentional in that way. I think they just noticed over time that these types of structures and behaviors tend to keep people around more, and people don't just kind of come and go. They feel invested. There's that kind of sunk cost piece to it. There's I've invested time and energy in this, and now I can't just leave. And if you leave, then bad things will happen. And so there's just a lot of those kinds of components that make the conditions for church to be potentially traumatizing for folks. Yeah, I think another thing worth noting is that organizations aren't safe for humans. That's just kind of how that is. And it's not a nefarious thing. It's not an intentional thing. It's just the reality is the organization cares more about the needs of the group than the needs of the individual members. And just to be blatant and honest about that, just to be like upfront about it, join our church. There's a chance that this is going to harm you. Join our church. We do care more about the reputation of this organization than we care about you as a person. And so like that honesty would be refreshing, because then the individual members can decide, like, okay, so how much trust am I placing in this? How much autonomy am I giving up to be part of this? And that can be more of a conscious choice. And as a therapist, as part of informed consent, folks know that therapy can be difficult. It can be challenging. Yeah. It can be re-traumatizing. It doesn't always go well. You have a medical procedure, there's a 1.5% chance that you're going to die on the operating table, and you're like, okay, I got to sign the form that says I agree this could harm me. You go to church and
form.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah,
there's a 8% chance you're coming at this rough.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be refreshing to have that conversation? Because then as a member, you're able to approach that from a perspective of, I need to do what I need to do for myself to be safe. I can participate and I can connect insofar as I feel safe doing that. But as soon as I'm like, this feels a bit controlling. In a fundamentalist system, you're like, well, then I need to be more submissive, or I need to just go along more. I need to have more faith. There's all this pressure to just kind of push past those kind of alarm bells going off in your body. But if we're starting with, if something comes up in therapy and it doesn't feel right to you, like you're within your right to say, no, I don't want to try this experience or this exercise. Yeah. And I will validate that and respect that, because your autonomy, your sense of safety is more important than anything else we're doing here. Yeah. And that's simply not the case in most churches.
No, not at all. I mean, I'm trying to think through. I mean, I have spent a lot of time in churches. I've spoken in over 1,000 churches. So, I mean, I've been around, and from a very diverse groupings of churches, not just within one kind of bubble. I think if I literally took that proposal to every church I've been in my life, I'd maybe have one or two say, okay, we'll experiment with that. But I mean, you're asking, fundamental faith is black and white. It's either right or it's wrong. And if it's right, then we couldn't possibly say, well, it's right, but 10% of you might not work out, might not go well. No, everyone will, apart from those people that backslide or didn't want to or didn't really believe in the first place, or any whatever we can narrative away that experience so that we still have 100%. We still have, this works, this is perfect, this is great. It's such a tall order. Do you think about that a lot when you're thinking about, you talk about how as Religious Trauma Institute, you're thinking, okay, RTI is going to go into churches and we're going to be talking about, like, hey, this is what causes trauma. This is how we, causing shame, causing these fear. Like, do you think churches are going to turn around and go, oh, I could see how we're creating shame there? Like, that's, I don't want to rain over your praise. I hear what you're saying. How do you think about that? Like, how are you strategizing in your head? Like, this is how we're going to try and approach churches. This is, or even, do you see certain types of churches being open to this? Are you going, we're talking the progressive church or the whatever church?
I think there is some low-hanging fruit, and I think, your UU churches, your more kind of progressive churches, they're probably already implementing some of these strategies, right? But where folks are being harmed the most are in these more closed systems, more fundamentalists. The absolute truth of the Bible is all that matters. We don't need any, psychological mumbo jumbo. And so I think we've done a bit of a disservice in more of the secular community, where we've created this antagonism between science and religion, or secular folks and religious folks. And so if we were to show up and be like, well, your religious beliefs are, fairy tales, and, it's not based in science, and you're stupid, essentially. And here's, we're going to tell you how you can, help protect the people in your church. Like, that's a non-starter. We're not going to have that conversation, right?
Yeah.
For us to really come from a place of, we want the same thing. We want to reduce human suffering. Then you have a particular way of doing that through the lens of Jesus and salvation and the church thing that you're doing. And we have a particular way of approaching that, from a, what works in terms of, we're not basing it on truth per se in this kind of written in stone kind of way, but truth from this more, contextual, functional perspective of, we're not telling you what to believe or how to believe it. We're just saying, when these messages are presented in this way, a certain percentage of the folks who hear that are going to have a hard time with that. What are you willing to do about that? We're not telling you how to do it or what to do or what to believe even. We're just saying, if that message is landing in a way that a person is feeling traumatized by that, like, acknowledging that would be helpful, Maybe there are ways internally to address that, to reduce the potential for harm. We're not saying that people need to leave the church to be safe. We're not saying that the only way to be safe in a religious community is to not believe. We're saying, like, there are just certain things that we humans, when we experience them, they're really difficult for our nervous system to handle, and maybe there are other ways of doing this. And so, I think, starting from a place of where they're at, and not coming at it from you're doing this wrong, and but how can you do this better? I think it is still a tall order, though, because these systems are in place because they work. People keep coming back. We see the more fundamentalist groups, kind of growing in numbers. More demands placed on folks, the more they stick around, and so to to question that at all, or to create some flexibility in that space, there's a potential people will not stick around. And I think we have a lot of work ahead of us there. But yeah, I think it's worth doing, having those conversations, and kind of seeing where that goes.
Yeah. Do you think in some ways trauma is, I don't want to believe this, but in part, is it just an inevitable part of some of the systems we need to grow up and through, up into and through? So I think of how we develop psychologically from a kind of more broad human psychological development. We start very egotistical. We then kind of start to move towards grouping, and then we become very egotistical, and then we kind of then look to a larger group where we kind of settle. We look for safety, certainty, security, and that's where the vast majority of people that find themselves in a fundamental religion have kind of settled down and stopped. And then the people that tend to deconstruct are then the ones who move back into the next stage, which becomes a bit more egotistical again. It becomes a bit more, but I'm a me. I don't have to give up my personal autonomy for this group. And actually, this is, that hurts. I'm kind of traumatized. Or, and we go through that process. I wonder, can we make a system that is quite black and white, quite fundamental, that does provide this safety, certainty, security? Here's some absolute truths for you to feel safe in, that many humans kind of just need to grow through. They have to go through that process on some level. Whether they're doing it at the age of 7 or whether they're doing it at 45, I mean, that's up in the air. Some people are running the world, and they're like at some of the earliest stages.
Yeah, sure. Exactly.
But can we create stages that are so absolute without traumatizing people? Because it feels almost like that just seems inevitable to me in some ways. I mean, that's obviously the goal, I guess. Do you feel there's an inevitability to it?
Yeah, it's a challenging question, because I think if we come at this from the perspective of our brains want certainty because there's a certain efficiency in that, they categorize things into simplistic boxes and categories, that frees up mental space to focus on other survival needs. And so to see that as a kind of a natural process that has, roots in our evolution, I think it's helpful to acknowledge that. When I think about what it takes to have the flexibility to explore the world and think about new ideas, there's a certain privilege implied in that, right? If our primary, needs aren't met, I'm not contemplating questions about God, or about spiritual things, or, evolving to my highest self. I'm worried about, living to the next day. I'm worried about, food on the table and those kinds of things. And so I think sometimes when we come at this from a more progressive view, we're like, but, everyone should be a bit more flexible in their thinking, and they shouldn't gravitate towards these controlling groups. It's like, well, maybe we should help them feel safe in the world and focus on their primary needs. And I think you'll see that within, religion, and fundamentalism, when there are, economic good times, people don't show up to church as often. The religions don't grow as much. When there's a lot of uncertainty or conflict in the world, then I'm craving a bit of certainty here. Like, life is really difficult. I want someone to tell me that I'm okay. I want someone to tell me that, it'll get better. And so I think, again, this is a challenging, or there's some tension here where if I'm a leader of a fundamentalist group, I want the world to be ending every month, right? I want there to be chaos in the world. I want things to be really, messed up. And I'm not particularly motivated to reduce suffering on a broader scale. I'm going to say, if you're going through a hard time, come to our church and we'll rescue you. But we're not going to, address the cause of your hunger. We're just going to say, we'll give you some food, but we're not going to say we need some systemic change for you to be healthier and more okay. Because if you're healthy and more okay, then you don't need what we have to offer as much. And so it feels like some of these, things are at odds with one another. And I think to even acknowledge that as well. But when it comes to, I think the question you're asking does trauma serve that function of helping a person go from this more black and white to a more evolved state, I think it can, for sure. I think Peter Levine talks about a trauma, really well known in the trauma field, talks about he would not wish trauma on anyone, but he would wish that post-traumatic growth on anyone, right? There's that, what you learn and experience from going through something can be really helpful. But again, to set up conditions for people to experience, trauma,
right?
not super great in terms of a compassionate approach. And so, I don't know. I think some of these things do correspond with people's development and deconstruction for sure. But it definitely is a mixed bag.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and very insightful. I appreciate that. Very, very fascinating. I just am fascinated about how people change and how people grow, what causes people. Yeah, why do some people start to deconstruct and a whole bunch of other people just go, no, I really need this safety. People complain so much. Fresh over there, in the States, the politics, the whole thing of it.
Sure.
But I remember when the 2016 elections results came in, everyone was shocked. And I remember I had looked at a poll that had happened, I think, before the election results, and it was asking people that were planning to vote for Trump why. And whether this was a truthful poll or not, there's many different things people go, well, they're secretly racist or they're secretly this. But the number one thing, I think it was like 79%, 78% of them had said that we want to vote Trump because we've either lost our job or we're scared we're going to lose our job, and he's promised he's going to keep our jobs or create jobs. And I was like, gosh, what a conversation that would have been if Democrats had said, oh, you're worried about your jobs? Gosh, we don't want you to have no jobs. We really want you to have jobs. We want to create employment. Now, I don't know if that would have changed anyone. Everyone votes for different reasons. I'm sure a lot of the fundamentals would be like, well, pro-life, or, different conversations.
Sure, yeah.
But it's this thing of not having those conversations, sitting in these privileged places where we go, well, I've got a job. I'm not that worried about it, whatever. Trump's promising jobs. Well, I've got one. I don't need Trump's job. What kind of job's Trump providing for me, or whatever. But you don't think of the person in the rural area that's just lost the coal mine's just been shut down or whatever, and that's all there is in the city. There's nothing but a coal mine. So what do we do now? And we can't sell this house to move somewhere else because no one wants to buy a house in an abandoned town. That's a terrifying place to be. Absolutely terrifying. Very probably trauma-inducing in many ways, potentially.
Oh, for sure. I think there's a lot of compassion there. A friend of mine and I we were talking a few nights ago about, like, what do we do with all this unresolved trauma that's kind of playing out in the U.S. right now, and I think it does really come down to that. Like, we're all trying to feel safe in different ways. Yeah. And some people need, 10 guns in their house and, a 4x4 truck, and they need to feel like they can, provide for themselves, because then they can sleep at night, then they can feel safe enough. And other folks need to have, more systemic structural changes so they can feel like, society is a loving, caring place, and I can be okay here. I don't feel threatened by others. When we look at it from that perspective, we can still have very difficult conversations about how do we best ensure, broad safety for the most number of folks. But to create these kind of, political divisions around, issues that may or may not have much to do with, why a person is voting for this person or not. It's like, well, Are we addressing those primary needs? Is that, and then from that place, you can make a decision about, like, what kind of person you want to support. But if you're like, I need to feel safe, and this person helps me feel safe, or they're promising to make me feel safe, then again, I think a lot of politics is driven by fear, which makes sense. Absolutely. And that ties back to our need for safety. And I think just acknowledging that, though, it's not about people being stupid. It's not about them being uninformed always. It's often about, this is how I've learned to try to achieve safety, and it's worked to a certain degree, and so I'm going to keep doing that. And until you're willing to offer me something to replace that, in trauma work, these unresolved trauma responses, dissociating, disconnecting, isolating. There's various, things that people will do that have been adaptive, that have allowed them to survive. We don't come in and say, hey, let's get rid of all those tools that you have, all those skills that you have, until we introduce new skills. And so we're adding tools, we're adding different abilities. And so I think in the same way to, you need to give up your guns and your religion in order to, participate in our society. That's a no-starter for a lot of folks because they don't feel safe enough to, they don't have other options. Yeah.
It's a really problematic thing, right? Because you've got two people living next door. One of them needs a bunch of guns to feel safe.
Yeah,
the person next door is literally every gun they buy feels a little less safe. They come home with the gunshot bag and they're like, oh, Jesus, I feel less safe. And the other person's thinking, I feel 10% safer. It's a hugely problematic conversation for sure. Talk to me about, this is fascinating to me because as much as this is an emerging conversation, a huge amount of people don't know this is going on. I mean, I talk to people every day that I'm not a clinician. I'm not diagnosing anyone, but I'm sitting there going, this sounds traumatic. That sounds like there's some trauma here. And I generally will say, hey, I would recommend checking out a therapist, maybe someone that does specialize in CPTSD or whatever, to have a conversation, just process and see what you think. Maybe it's a great idea to put them through to your website so they can do a survey or whatever. Maybe does that give some indication to them after they do it and say, hey, this is kind of, you scored something or are you not doing it?
So our goal is that'll be kind of the next stage, right?
I guess you need the data to build the skill.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yep, that's where we're at.
Okay, so I guess my point being, so a lot of people they're not aware that they have these kind of deep-seated traumas. And yet are living with the consequences of that. I mean, that's trauma, right? You live with the consequences, whether you know you got it or not. How do people, maybe people are listening to this and going, gosh, that sounds, a lot of the stuff you're talking about, I've been through that stuff or whatever. How do people go about starting to identify, gosh, I maybe have trauma? Is there particular things that they should look for? Maybe specific identifiers that they can go, ooh, I do that. Or
yeah, sure. I think this really points to the need for more education. When people talk about PTSD or trauma, a lot of folks will think of, I didn't experience anything that bad. I didn't experience a physical assault, or I didn't see, some horrific event happen in front of me. And so therefore I'm not even, considering trauma as being a possibility. And then there's another group of folks that, are kind of using trauma in a more colloquial sense and this was traumatic because something small happened and it wasn't actually resulting in them experiencing trauma. It just, they're just using that word kind of loosely. And so I think just the understanding of trauma is not attached to the event itself opens up the possibility. Okay, so I thought trauma was about something really horrific, a big T trauma, single incident trauma, something really big and significant. And now we're saying, well, that's not really how we're measuring trauma. That's one form of trauma, but that's not how we're measuring all the ways that we're understanding trauma. One thing that we like I said, we've introduced adverse religious experiences as a concept to kind of reduce the bar in terms of, most people, when they hear the word trauma and they grew up in maybe a fundamentalist church, they're like, nothing really that bad happened. Even folks who have experienced significant trauma, survivors will often say, well, that was just what it was like to live in my family, That's just kind of how it was. There's kind of a normalizing of that experience and they're not attuned to how that is impacting them. And then when they realize oh, you mean I can actually go through the day without kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop. I'm not constantly on edge. And humans can do that. We don't realize it until, we have that experience. It's kind of like, carrying a backpack with you all day and you just kind of get used to it. It's just there. And then you don't notice how heavy it was until you take it off. And you're like, there it is. There's the weight. I think trauma is similar in that regard where there's just well, that's just what it was like to grow up in my family, as opposed to recognizing that as showing up as unresolved survival responses to a chaotic or overwhelming environment. And so I think tuning into our body, our nervous system when possible, that's not always possible for someone who's experienced trauma, because trauma does often disconnect us from our felt sense experience. Beginning to be curious about that, noticing shifts and changes when I moved from different environments. I remember as a kid going to church, just the pit of the stomach feeling, like, oof. And it wasn't because I was bored or disinterested. It was like, this is a scary place for me, right? Certain songs, smells, memories, and you notice that all of a sudden I don't feel quite as safe or as okay. Those can be indications that, there's something unresolved that needs to be addressed. And each nervous system will have, a different response to that. And the stories and narratives that we construct from those experiences will be unique and different to each person as well. But I think focusing more on those responses as opposed to, I grew up in a fundamentalist church, so therefore I must have experienced religious trauma. There's a chance that you did. But some folks get through that unscathed, they're like moving on to the next progressive church or moving on and, I'm good to go. And I think that often happens when folks describe their trauma to other believers or, other folks like, well, I was there too. I went to the same church. I heard that same message. Like that didn't bother me at all. Yeah. Many factors that can contribute to that. And to just acknowledge that it's, a person's experiencing trauma, not because I've decided that the event was significant enough. Yep. But that there's, all these factors of, this mismatch between, your internal versus external experiences. And So
I guess what the body decides is a safe or danger signal is going to be very different for different people based on whether they've experienced that. And the body goes, oh no, I've done that before and it's fine. And I got to resolve it or whatever. So now that's kind of a safe signal. It's a lesser danger. So it's going to be very unique. I guess that makes sense. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think just noticing some of the other components to that as well, if you're a white cishet male in an evangelical setting, it's not going to be as traumatic for you potentially as, a sexual gender minority in that same setting because they're required to be submissive or they have less access to power and resources. And so there's already a demand on their nervous system, something that pushes them over their capacity then could be traumatizing, where someone with a lot of access to power in that setting is like, wasn't that big of a deal for me? Sure. It's like, well, like it's a subjective experience in that regard. Yeah. Yeah.
Gosh, well, some of those gender minorities, some of those non-binary options or whatever. I mean, you're not allowed to exist. Talk about high stress, constant alert kind of scenario. Yeah. I mean, it's wild to think of. I mean,
I think the other thing, because it showed up in our survey as well, and because it is often connected to trauma, I think shame. So if you're feeling a lot of shame, let's be curious about that. And maybe it's worth kind of describing the adaptive survival function of shame, right? We think of shame as having kind of like little or no value for us humans. It's just a really debilitating, uncomfortable, unpleasant experience. And Gabor Mate, a trauma a physician, was talking about, he gave this example that I think is worth kind of repeating here. Imagine that you're like a 4-year-old boy or a 4-year-old kid, and you're witnessing your parents fighting. And it's getting kind of aggressive, it's getting kind of violent. And you're seeing this, and you don't have the capacity to like make sense of it. It's like these humans who are my caregivers, that I need them for my safety and support, and all of a sudden, like, what's going on? Would it be better or safer or more okay for that nervous system to assume my parents don't care about me, they're actually not safe for me, this is really bad, I'm not going to survive this? Would that be a safe, viable option? Or would it be more adaptive for that nervous system to say, yeah, it's probably something that I did. If I were to just be more obedient, if I would have cleaned up the house better, if I would have done whatever, and blame myself. So this kind of internalizing that why that's adaptive is if I take that on myself, I can still sort of make sense of the world. There's still the possibility that my parents aren't dangerous, that they still do love me. There's this kind of trying to gain a sense of security or safety from that, a sense of control. And then if I blame myself, there's a chance I can do something about it. I can change, right?
Yeah.
And so when we think about how shame is wielded inside of a religious context as well, it's never the church's fault. It's never the doctrine's fault. It's like, well, you're not believing enough. You're not praying enough. There's that. It's you. It's always you. When things go well, God's blessing. When things go poorly, there's something wrong with you. And so to internalize that shame as a way of surviving in a religious structure, that can be very powerless. It can be very overwhelming. It can be very difficult for a nervous system to kind of survive that. It can be traumatizing. Shame and trauma often go together because of that. And so, I think recognizing that, noticing how much shame am I carrying around with me, that's directly connected to my experience in the church, and not just the thoughts or the beliefs, but the felt sense. That kind of heaviness, that constriction. I'm not okay. Being aware of that, and then beginning to question, like, what is it that I need to feel a bit safer, a bit stronger, a bit more connected? Who do I need to say no to, push away, set a boundary? I think there's that's when you can begin to do some of the healing work around trauma. There's a kind of a pushing out of that freeze collapse state into a more activated fight or flight state. This is the gazelle we talked about earlier, springing up and then completing that earlier process. Setting those boundaries, pushing away, doing something aggressive, assertive, powerful, can be a way to begin to undermine that feeling of stuck.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. I guess something you mentioned really early on in the talk was that you talked about how deconstruction itself can be quite traumatizing potentially. Do you have advice for people that are maybe just starting to tiptoe into the deconstruction? Maybe they're 10 years in and they're still going, God, I have no idea what the hell's going on. How do we avoid re-traumatizing ourselves or traumatizing ourselves in a whole new way as we go about deconstruction? Because deconstruction is something that, if we go from a stage where we wanted certainty and security and safety, deconstruction is none of those things, right? It's uncertain, it's insecure, and it is not safe. It doesn't feel safe, right? It feels very unsafe. It feels like we're setting ourselves up for this hugely terrible, awful experience, which I know for a lot of people, it's a wonderful, exciting experience. And for many people, it's both. The vast majority, it's a big mix of everything, isn't it? So what can people do?
I think you bring up a really great point. And what's the difference between the person who's like, oh, it's fascinating. Like, look at all these scriptures and look at all this new information I have. And how can I make sense of this? And it can be really exciting. It can be fueled by curiosity and wonder and like, let's figure things out. And, I would assume that there's a certain foundation of safety operating for that person's nervous system to be able to consider and hold these kind of opposing ideas at the same time, and like, maybe I don't have to know the answer to this and I'll still be okay. There's a certain level of safety and okayness already there. When it comes to kind of deconstructing in this very disembodied way, like it's just all mental and I'm not tracking with my nervous system. I'm not, paying attention to, like I've been spending a lot of time reading about hell and it just feels really risky. Like I can't quite shake it. I'm not sure if I'm okay. Or I'm considering like maybe Jesus isn't who I thought he was, or maybe, some other really fundamental belief is being questioned and there's no capacity to just allow there to be space for it and be flexible with it. But it's like, this feels like I'm not safe and okay here. What do you need to feel safe and okay first might be a way of approaching that. And I think that's where deconstruction itself can be a context where we experience trauma. It may not be the kind of primary source of it, But when we think about kind of, cognitive load, mental load, load on our nervous system, deconstruction is not just about rearranging the narrative or the thoughts. It's like, my parents won't speak to me anymore. It's the, can I belong to this community that's been a source of support for me, and now I have to kind of build from the ground up. Will I, be okay? Can I survive this? Do I have enough resources? My job is connected to the church. There's all these other factors. And so it's not just a philosophical kind of experience. It's like, this has real world implications that connect directly to my sense of safety. And as you know, working in this space, there are a lot of folks who don't believe, and they're still going to church every week because it's required for their survival, right?
Absolutely.
What is that experience like? Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, many of them
more so, right? Because
absolutely,
what are they going to do without this job? Or
Yeah. No, I'm sure that there are numerous, and in fact, in my experience, and I think some of the research holds this to be true as well, that the more committed you are, the more invested you are, the more likely you are to go through this deconstruction process.
Absolutely.
And in fact, if I were to, if maybe part of my harm reduction for churches would be, if you want to maintain membership, just kind of have these, the kinds of Christians that God would spew out of his mouth, the lukewarm Christians,
just that don't,
they really don't, invest too much time in exploring or asking questions or taking it too seriously. And so, I think when you move up into leadership, or you begin to see kind of how the sausage is made behind the scenes, you're like, whoa, I have some serious questions now all of a sudden, whereas I'm just showing up on Sunday and, it's nice to see people who look familiar and sing some songs together and, have a talk. They're less likely to be seriously questioning this. Yeah. And so, I think paying attention to the felt sense experience of that can be a way of maybe pumping the brakes a bit. I don't have the capacity to kind of keep diving into this. What do I need to build a bit more capacity first? Yeah.
I think there's so much at play there as well. And I think people give themselves a really hard time in this process as well. People, why is this taking so long? I've been doing this for a couple of years, or I've been doing this for 2 weeks and I've not figured it out, or, there's a whole levels of impatience. I'm the 2 week guy. But it is really fascinating, you talk about how we are set up for maybe success and not, but I've always been fascinated about how I've approached this process, because I deal with so many people, I talk to so many people, and I'm like, gosh, 95% of the people at least find this very difficult and very hard. And I loved almost every step of the way. And I'm like, what was different? But it was fascinating. My mother did bring me up from a very young age to say, don't believe what people tell you. Weigh it, listen to it, even if it's me. And I think she regretted that quite But she was like, you question authority. You might not always know the answers. We sometimes don't know. And she would very frequently be like, I don't know always. And that probably was not helpful for me at certain stages of my childhood. But actually, when it came to deconstruction, it was really normal for me to be like, well, I've been questioning stuff all the way along, and there's just some new questions. But on the flip side, I'm very disassociated. I'm not very in my body. I'm not very attached to my emotions. I have alexithymia. I've got very low interoception. Lots of things that cause me to not be present in what's going on. So the other side of me goes, maybe I'm just massively traumatized and I just don't know. So that's the other side of it. So, but I think it's really, it just highlights you can have these different components going on in your own background, your own creation. As you've gone along, and it can completely change if you're going to end up traumatized or not. It's so huge, really fascinating. Do you have? I don't know if data will exist on this. It's probably far too early. But do you have an idea, a hypothesis on how widespread religious trauma is amongst fundamental churches, or even people as they come out of fundamental churches, how likely is it that do you reckon half the people, do you reckon it's 10%? What do you have ideas, or is there data even?
So I would be kind of taking a stab in the dark. I think
I won't hold you to it.
But I am interested in talking about the conditions for trauma and how prevalent those are. And I think there is a selection bias. The folks who I work with tend to be the ones who are traumatized. And so I'm like, oh yeah, like, my God, like all the churches are traumatizing folks. And I'm not working with the folks who are like, yeah, church is great for me. And so I'm aware of that. However, just thinking about the experience that folks have in order to kind of survive in a space. And I think maybe distinguishing between safety versus survival. You can survive in a freeze collapse state for a long time indefinitely. You can survive in a please appease state for a long time indefinitely. And when we think about what's required to be part of a high control or high demand group, often it's that I don't get to have my own sense of autonomy and power. I have to go along with the group in order to be okay. And so when my safety is external to me, if I go along, then I get to survive. If I please and appease, I get to live another day. When I think about the number of nervous systems in fundamentalism that are existing inside of a survival physiology, and they really are just surviving as opposed to feeling safe, I think that percentage is really high. And I think especially for certain marginalized groups within that space as well, like it's even higher. And so when we confuse safety for survival, right? You're like, well, their needs are met, everything's fine. Like they keep coming back, like, well, I can't leave my husband because if I do, I can't survive on my own because I don't have an education because the church said I wasn't supposed to be educated, and I have children, maybe more kids than I wanted to have personally, and I feel responsible for them, and so of course I'm surviving, but I don't feel safe, and so I think. That creates conditions for trauma for sure. How much of that results in trauma for individuals, what those numbers are, I really don't know. But when I think about the impacts of that, and when I talk about this in different places, folks will be like, oh yeah, like I totally get what you're saying. Like I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel okay. And when it comes to kind of developmental trauma, early childhood trauma, that we're discovering is even more traumatizing than kind of big single incident traumas. There's a component of there's a caregiver that is a source of comfort and safety and support, and I want to move towards that. My nervous system orients towards connection, but they're also kind of harsh and cruel and punishing at times, and so I want to move away. And I'm caught between, do I move away or toward, and there's that kind of feeling paralyzed or trapped there. And then it's hard to make sense of the world when I don't know whether the world's safe or not. I would sooner know that my caregiver is always abusive because then I can adapt to that. Yeah. But I don't know whether it's safe or not. And I think about a lot of fundamentalist Christians, their view of God. You know, he's this lovely, caring, are you describing a parent or a God? But the same, yeah. Actually, I have a book on my bookshelf I haven't got to yet, but it talks about attachment through God and attachment in religion, and God isn't a primary attachment figure because he's not a living nervous system in front of us that we can actually physically connect to. And yet, God is often kind of a pseudo-attachment figure. And when we begin to kind of connect and relate to that, and then there is this sense of, I know God loves me, but also if I masturbate, I'm going to go to hell. And it's like, but I'm going to masturbate. And so like, well, am I okay or not? And there's that kind of like, and that's really hard on the nervous system to handle, right? Yeah. And then layers of shame and judgment. Straight, yeah, sure. Yeah, like, exactly. Geez, that
jacked me up like terribly. It was like, yeah, no doubt. And I'm not an anomaly
at all. No, I've talked to more than more than one person who they were going to castrate themselves. That sounds very extreme, but you know, a lot of folks have had that same thought. You know, like, it would be better if I did this extreme thing, to kind of be able to survive. And I was at a conference
where someone actually showed up and did that. And had to be rushed away in an ambulance, and everyone was like, "What happened?" And it was this guy castrated himself in the church, you know, and that's a wake up call in a moment. But to be honest with you, it didn't wake me up.
Right.
I was just like, "Oh, well, that's a bit crazy." And then I went back to the same thoughts, you know. I'm not going to follow through on that or whatever, but still reading those passages that say, "Well, it'd be better off that you pluck your eye out than look at someone," or you know, like, what's the analogy there? Better off if you then watch porn and masturbate or whatever, right? Where am I supposed to draw the analogy here?
Right.
And so, it's no joke what people are going through, and the shame and the heartbreak. Wow. Yeah.
And I think also when it comes to trauma, the real or perceived threat, you know, we might say, well, nothing bad actually happened, you know. And after you deconstruct the idea of hell, there's that, well, it doesn't exist, so why are you bothered by that? And because it was a perceived threat that your nervous system responded to as if it were real. I think that's a really important piece. Something that I find with folks who are deconstructing that I wanted to share with you and your audience as well. Part of resolving trauma is being able to do what you needed to do then, but you weren't able to. And so kind of saying no, pushing away, setting a boundary, like, I need to know that it's safe and okay to do that. I don't have a point of reference for what it feels like for me to be the one in charge to say, like, no, you do not treat me this way. When we began to deconstruct the idea of God, sometimes this God figure who was a bit of a monster and wasn't a safe kind of being for us, we need to push him away, because it's always a him, right? We need to push this God being away, and then he begins to evaporate in front of us. There's like, I no longer believe in God, and so again, there's this kind of unresolved quality to that, and so I think there's some hope here, though, because just as we can, recall or imagine a horrific experience that we experienced in the past, and our body will have a kind of a visceral response to that. And in that same way, we can imagine saying no, pushing against a God who we no longer believe in. We can imagine what it would be like to say no, to have that conversation with him, to be like, how dare you treat humans this way? You know, I'm a more moral, compassionate being than you are. I would never treat my kids this way, and have that kind of forceful, powerful, response that will begin to communicate to our nervous system as a very real thing, right? I know what it's like to really do what's necessary, and so it's not surprising to folks that a memory can trigger a physiological response about something horrific that happened. What we often don't recognize is that we can connect to a real physiological experience of safety, of strength, of power, and to begin to approach that from a more somatic place, as opposed to, I'm going to deconstruct a belief or an idea. Your brain will love that, but your body's like, hey, what about me? I don't feel safe down here, you know. And so I haven't written about this yet, but I'm exploring the idea of knowing God, and not with the K-N-O-W, but just N-O-I-N-G, knowing, saying no to God, establishing consent in that relationship where it had no possibility of existing before, because you had to go along or else you were toast, right? You had to go along or else you'd be punished, and to experience that, even if you maintain your faith, there's a relationship that you can develop some level of consent, potentially, right? Yeah. Depending on how you conceptualize God. But yeah, that the ability to say no, to push back, to do what needs to be done, is so important for us to feel safe in the world. Yeah.
I can totally say that sounds amazing. Yeah. I guess related to that, and we need to wind up here, but I'm just constantly, everything you say, I'm like, next question, I've got a great idea. related to that, I've seen a lot of people respond very differently to this, but I think it's in somewhat relation to that is their process of coming out, their process of talking to family members, telling a pastor, hey, I think you're full of bullshit and I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm sorry. Obviously, there are very specific situations where that's not safe. And, you shouldn't. You need to figure out a way to do that in a safe way and in a healthy way. Some people will never confront certain other people, and that's a really good idea not to do that. However, do you recommend that is something that people go through a process for, if it can be done in a safe and healthy way? It feels like it would very much be a similar process of knowing that environment, that structure, that person, that relationship. Not maybe knowing the relationship, but the dynamic of that relationship, the system of it, and maybe setting boundaries or whatever it might be.
Yeah, if we're not intentional about that, our nervous system will find ways of reenacting trauma for us. It's a fascinating thing that our bodies do. If you have maybe you were in a car accident at one point, and then you find yourself driving fast around the same kind of curve, but this time you feel like you're about to go out of control, but this time you correct just in time, right? Again, when you were traumatized, I wasn't able to correct in time. I was in an abusive relationship and I wasn't able to get out in time. I suffered trauma because of that. And now I find a similar kind of partner. And why it's confused. It's puzzling to us. Why are people making these really poor choices, we think? Well, they're trying to resolve their trauma. They're not doing it maybe in the healthiest and safest way possible, but they need to resolve their trauma. And so if I find a similar narcissist but I'm able to say no, I'm able to escape in time, then I'm like, I'm okay. I can trust myself again. I'm capable of doing this. And so when it comes to, confronting a pastor or having those conversations with family members, it doesn't have to be face-to-face. In fact, you can have the same physiological experience in the safety of your therapist office or at home. But it is really, really important. I do an exercise where imagine that someone's kind of, pushing against you. And even if you were to just kind of hold your hands by your shoulders like this, I just notice my breathing becomes a bit more shallow. There's just like, this doesn't feel safe. I know these are my hands. I've done this exercise 1,000 times, but there's like, the breath goes in and then it's just this kind of shallow breathing. And then I imagine what it would be like to say no and to forcefully push out. And there's this kind of middle space where there's this aggression, this power, this fight or flight response. And I'm like, no. And then there's this all the way out. And it's like, no. Yeah, like I've neutralized the threat completely. And I'm just like, no. No. If you just say no with your voice, that's going to be powerful to some level, right? But there's this physical pushing out, and even if you were to just imagine pushing out without actually physically doing that, you're just like if I were to imagine running, I notice my legs begin to move a little bit, and there's this like, okay, this is what it feels like to run. I'm kind of bringing those sensations into my body again in a way that my nervous system can, take those signals, because the language of the nervous system is more sensation. And begin to approximate what I needed to do then. And so, definitely having those difficult conversations or saying what needs to be said can be a very powerful thing. Reenacting that in a way that, there's not enough safety or support around you, it can be re-traumatizing. And so there is a risk of that. Yeah. But I think honoring that impulse to do that, why does this feel so important that I, confront this person? Because there's this unresolved experience that I don't feel safe. I don't feel like I can just freely move about the world, because what if I see them somewhere, or what if they saw this, control over me? And I need to kind of regain that control. And so, finding ways to do that in a very powerful somatic way, can be. We experience the world through our sensations first, and then our mind kind of creates the narrative. And if we begin to shift and change how we physically feel in the world, it's going to begin to construct different stories. And so that can be an effective part of deconstructing as well. it's not just a mental process. It can be a more embodied process.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much. I feel like maybe we need to revisit in a year or so and do another chat. I absolutely love your work. I am so thankful for what you're doing. Really thankful you took so much time to share with us here. If people want to connect with you and your work, what are the best ways they can be connecting with you?
Yeah, so Room to Thrive is the name of my private practice. My website, roomtothrive.com, on pretty much all the socials, Instagram and Facebook. I'm more active there, Twitter as well, but it's all at Room to Thrive. And then the Religious Trauma Institute, you can go to just religiostraumainstitute.com, or on the socials on Instagram and Facebook at Religious Trauma Institute, and on Twitter at Religious Trauma. Those would be the best ways to connect with me.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. And I really encourage people dive into your stuff for sure. And
thank you so much.
That's really exciting. And I'm excited. I'm already thinking, gosh, I've got someone that I can talk to in the future, because one of the studies we want to look at is fallout of trauma within deconstruction. So maybe we can work together. Hopefully, if you've got a scale by that point, we can maybe incorporate that into
so there is a spiritual abuse scale that one of my colleagues has developed as part of her graduate program. And so, we're looking to adapt that as well. There are various research projects happening, and part of Religious Trauma Institute is we're actually we'll be rolling out here in the next week or so a collaborative research group for graduate students and academic researchers, university labs and so forth, who are looking at doing work in this space. So that's awesome. We're not doing the actual research ourselves, but creating a context for them to communicate and share resources with each other.
That's amazing. Definitely. I want to get stuck into that. And I'm sure people listen. I talk to researchers frequently that are, grad students, whatever, people in different places they have deconstructed, and therefore it's led their work to want to look into these things, trauma and things like that as well. So that's a great resource for people to check out. I'll send you a few scales as well. There's another scale that another one of my friends and colleagues developed as part of her graduate work, on kind of the mental health impacts of this spiritual struggle, I think is the scale, a spiritual struggle scale. Okay. And so which kind of, overlays on top of deconstruction. I'll send you a few other resources as well. That's awesome. Cool. I'm really excited. And I'm really excited to see how it does map with long term as well, because I think it's going to be really interesting to see if it does kind of steady out over time, if it just goes like most people, right? Most Christians are like, oh, this is just a downward slope to hell. Now you're doomed. And there is a lot of data on the wellness of people as they leave church does drop significantly. Mental wellness. And so I'm really intrigued to go, what does that look like longer term?
I actually the study that I just referred to, they mapped on the psychological flexibility as well. Like how overwhelming that was, like how rigid they were in their process and approach to that. And some pretty cool findings there. So I bet. Oh, awesome.
Yeah,
thanks so much, Phil.
Forever,
for sure.
We should wrap up. But,
sounds good.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Take care.
Have a good one.
Yeah.
Bye. Ciao.